There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst. Welcome, everybody, on week number 3. Welcome to all of you who are joining by live stream, and also hello to the folks who are over in the Life Center. Week number 3, as we're thinking about when life is difficult. And every week we're trying to help you just kind of wrap your mind around a couple questions. Number 1 is, why do bad things happen? Number 2, where is God when these bad things are happening? And number 3, what is it that I can do now that I'm in the midst of a difficult time? This morning I'm going to spend a little more time talking about why do bad things happen and what's God doing, and the devotional resource that you can pick up on the way out if you haven't already. That's going to give you a lot more insight about what are some of the things you can do when you are in times of great difficulty. So again, thanks for being with us on week number 3. Next week we finish up this series. Let me show you a bell curve that may help you make sense out of what's going on. So right now I'm aware that in this room, the whole spectrum is sitting here. There are some people that life is very, very good. There's hardly a difficult thing happening. Skies are sunny, the weather is clear, smooth sailing. And then there are a few people that life is the exact opposite. It is dark. It might even be horrible. You cannot see a way past the storm. Very, very bleak. And then everything in between. For probably a lot of us, there's a mixture of good and bad, sometimes a little more good, a little more bad. But that's right now what we have in this particular room. And somehow I hope this will be speaking for all of us. Now, there's another way you can look at this graph, and that is just look at it as you personally. There are seasons in your life where it's going to be really, really great. And there could be a few seasons in your life when life just is not going very good at all and might even be pretty bad. In fact, maybe a year ago, if you were going to think about where you were a year ago, wow, a year ago life was really different than it is today. Now, it might have been better, it might have been worse. And I wonder what's going to happen a year from now. What will life be like then? So really, as we go through life, we experience the different parts of this scale. And one more way to think about this is that there are entire groups, in fact, entire nations, that at times they go through this particular spectrum. There are some places on planet Earth where generally life is great, things are going very, very well for those particular people. And then there are places on planet Earth where it's really hard. And for example, right now, if you've been following the news, wouldn't you say that for most people in Venezuela, life is like terrible? I mean, how bad can it get? And just when you think it got about as bad as it can, it seems like it's getting worse. So, I mean, this particular scale works in all kinds of ways. But here's what I want you to think about. Right here, right now, today, where would you place yourself on this scale in terms of life is really great or life is maybe even terrible? So kind of hold that particular thought in mind. So here's one of the things we understand, and that very simply, we live in a fallen world. It is not the way it is supposed to be. Bad things happen quite often. Now, I want to do a little bit of audience participation and just kind of cooperate with me. You're not going to embarrass yourself. And so what I'm going to wind up doing is I'm going to ask you a few questions. And if the question, if you're going to answer yes about you personally, or about maybe your family and extended family, or perhaps a good friend of yours, I'd like you to stand. And I just want you guys to get a sense of how many of us are experiencing this. So how many of you right now are in some way, shape, or form dealing with a cancer diagnosis? You, your family, or a good friend. Would you guys just stand so we can kind of get a sense of how many people are impacted by this thing called cancer? Just look around for a moment. As I was saying, it's a pretty significant number of people. Okay, thank you. You can be seated. It's a pretty significant number of people who are dealing with this. You know, by the way, that cancer is the number 2 leading cause of death in the United States. Last year, about 600,000 people died because of cancer. Okay, let me just, one more about some kind of disease-related things. So the number 1 cause of death is heart disease. And how many of you and your family, or a pretty good friend, there's been some kind of heart issues going on like in the last 12 months? Would you guys just go ahead and stand up so we can get a sense of how many people are dealing with heart-related issues? Yeah. So again, those two, thank you, you can be seated. So those two things are the number 1 and number 2 leading causes of death in the United States. Number 3 is accidents. Now, I'm not going to ask you to stand if you, family, or a friend have been a victim of an accident, but last year about 161,000 people died because of accidents. And wow, how hard is that? The accidents are something that, if you have heart disease, if you have cancer, at least you sort of know what's going on, but accidents come out of nowhere, and they are disruptive in the influence that they have on us. You drop down to like number 4 and 5, and now they have these lower respiratory issues going on and stroke, and you throw those two things together, another 200,000 people die every year because of those things. You drop down a little bit lower on the list. Here's one that should be a cause of concern for all of us. But last year, there were about 50,000 opioid-related deaths in our nation. Now, what's really striking about that is 20 years ago, there were 8,000. So we're just seeing this massive increase in opioid use and abuse, and we're going to see more and more repercussions. And last year, this seems to stay pretty even, but about 47,000 people died because of suicide. And then all the families were left to deal with that. So, if I would have asked, if I would have mentioned all those and say, hey, if you've been affected by any of those, just stand up, we'd have all kinds of people standing up. That's a shared life experience because we live in a fallen world. All right, here's another one. How many of you have attended a funeral in the last 12 months? So go ahead and stand if you've attended a funeral service. Now, it's not your own, obviously, but if you've attended a funeral service. If you attended a funeral service that was your own, talk to me afterwards. We need to have. Yeah, look at that. Okay, look how much death has touched our lives. Okay, you can be seated. The last one, you guys have been really, really cooperative. All right, if you're getting older, would you please stand? Come on. I didn't ask if you're old, I asked if you're getting older. All right, there's a whole lot of you that you're living in this place called denial of reality, but that's okay. Hey, so listen, but that's kind of what we have with a fallen world. There's sickness and there's disease and there's this whole aging process where we slowly begin to not be quite as agile as we once were. And then eventually there's this thing called death. And all that's because we live in a fallen world. If I would have also asked you, hey, if you have been personally hurt or injured by somebody in some way over the last 12 months, would you stand? I think just about everybody here would stand up because we're always dealing with folks who make some bad choices that wind up hurting us. And so that's kind of what's involved in living in a fallen world. The Apostle Paul uses this language in Romans chapter 8. He said this fallen world groans. The world itself, life itself, groans because it knows it's not the way it's supposed to be. It knows the world doesn't work the way it was meant to be. It knows things are broken, sometimes are broken bad. The world itself is groaning, and we who are in the world, we groan as well. I just want to tell you a little bit of a story of a guy named Jerry Sitzer who wrote a book, A Grace Disguised. Subtitle was How the Soul Grows Through Loss. At one point, on that chart of life being pretty good, the life being terrible, on one day, life was actually pretty darn good for him. And in the space of about 20 minutes, it went from being pretty good to tragic beyond understanding. Let me just tell you a little bit about the beginning of his story. He and his family were out at an outing, and they were having a really nice vacation day, a great time. And now they're driving back home. And as they're driving back home, he notices in the distance there was a car coming down the road toward them at a very high rate of speed. And the driver of that car loses control. It turns out the driver was just completely inebriated out of his mind and going about 85 miles an hour and loses control and crashes headlong into Jerry's van. Linda, my wife, my 4-year-old daughter, my wife, Linda, my 4-year-old daughter, Diana Jane, and my mother were all killed in that crash. I remember getting Catherine, who's in David 7 and John 2, out of the van through the only door that would work. I remember taking pulses. I remember giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, trying to save the dying. And listen to this. I watched Linda, I watched my mother, and I watched Diana Jane all die before my eyes. Because listen, we're just talking about catastrophic loss of the unimaginable kind. And I remember the realization sweeping over me that I would soon plunge into a darkness from which I might never again emerge as a sane, normal, believing man. And life became nothing but a long groan for Jerry and his surviving kids. I'm going to come back to the story. I'm going to read you the end of the story because it's really quite remarkable, but that's the beginning of that particular chapter in his life, just groaning, and it just seemed the groaning got worse as the weeks went by. Not only do we live in a fallen world, but we also live in a very finite world. We live in a fallen world, but we are very finite. And that is, we just have an extremely limited understanding of what is going on. We see so little, we see so dimly, first of all, about what's going on, but even more dimly about what might be happening down the road. We just are so finite in our perspective. The book of Ruth is actually an illustration in that. Ruth is very early in the Bible, after the first 5 books of the Bible. Then you come to Joshua and Judges, and then right after that is a short 4-chapter long book of Ruth. So it's a very ancient story. And it's a story of a woman named Naomi, who is an Israelite, and she and her husband and their 2 sons, they actually moved to Moabite during a time of famine and drought in Israel, very, very bad. So they go someplace so they have a better kind of life, and so they do. And the sons grow older, and the sons eventually marry Moabite women from that other land. Life's going along reasonably well, but then a series of things happen. That Naomi's husband dies and her 2 sons die, and she is left with only her 2 foreign Moabite daughter-in-laws. Now, knowing the culture back then, that is a situation of it's just dire conditions. There's no way that they can survive. Naomi knows that she needs to get back home, and she encourages her daughter-in-laws to stay there. One of them, named Ruth, says, "No, Naomi, where are you going to go? I'm going to go. Your people, your God, my God." Very, very famous language. So Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth trek back to Israel. They get back to Naomi's village where she's from, and it's been a long time, and the women, they're looking at all that's going on. She's much, much older. She's like, "Is this Naomi? Could this be Naomi?" And Naomi winds up responding, saying, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter," because that's what the word means. That's what the name means. Call me bitter. And she winds up talking about, "I went away full, and I've come back completely empty. I come back crushed and broken. And God Almighty has done this to me. I mean, I was in a great condition. Look what happened. It's God's fault." And see, that's what happens when all kinds of difficulty happens, certainly when catastrophic difficulty happens, but when all kinds of difficulty happen, I mean, we automatically start to with our finite understanding, put the blame on God. Look at what God is doing. And can I just suggest, while God can always send difficulty, and sometimes he does, he really doesn't need to, because life itself, this broken, fallen world, is always throwing hard stuff at us, isn't it? I mean, you don't ever need to blame God for the hard times you're going through. Just life itself is throwing hard things our way. But that's where Naomi is. She's bitter. Well, you start reading through chapter 2 and chapter 3, and you start to see there's some things being orchestrated. It's very dangerous for Ruth, a young woman being there, very vulnerable, very at risk. And the next thing you know, there's a man from Naomi's tribe, and he starts to become her protector and her guardian, and he winds up actually falling in love with her. And he winds up going through a series of situations where he winds up becoming the husband to Ruth. And as we're going through this, Naomi's realizing, hey, some things are happening. God seems to be at work. And like in chapter 2, she's no longer saying, "Call me bitter." She's starting to have a little bit of sense of praise and some prayer to God. But it's not until we get to the end of the book in chapter 4, where I want you to hear the kind of language that Naomi is now saying. The one who started out saying, "Call me bitter," she's now saying this. All the women there say, "Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." And Naomi gets that. She says, "Oh yeah, when I thought it was so bad, God was still the guardian redeemer, and he was still providing one for me. And now your daughter-in-law, she's married and she's had a son. Naomi, you got a grandson." And Naomi took this grandson in her arms and she cared for him. And all the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. And so Naomi, whose life started out pretty good and then went to a very almost catastrophic loss where she said, "Just call me bitter." She winds up moving into a place where God has been her guardian and her redeemer. She didn't see it coming, but God did, and he was. And she now has a grandson, and his name is Obed. But you know what she doesn't know, because she's going to die before she finds out, is Obed eventually gets married, and he eventually has a kid named Jesse. And Jesse eventually gets married, and Jesse has a kid named, well, we know him as King David. Isn't that amazing? God knew that there was a King David that was going to be coming from Naomi's line, and he wound up knowing that. But Naomi, in her limited, finite setting, she had no clue what was going on right now, and she had even less clue what was going to happen in her future, and she had zero clue what God was going to do in the generations to come. See, that's what happens with our finite understanding. We just come to all kinds of wrong conclusions. Here's a great saying by a guy named Kierkegaard. I want us to remember this particular line. "We live life forward, but we understand it backward." Isn't that so true? See, when we're in the midst of stuff, we can barely understand what's going on. It's not until we get a little ways down the road and we look back and say, "Oh, so now I get it. Now I see some things that were taking place. In the moment, I was so consumed, I couldn't sort it through, but now I can." When I was in my hardest season of life, I call it my wilderness season, I had no idea what God was going to do. I just knew I was clinging on for my sanity, my spirituality. Was I even going to remain a follower of Jesus Christ? And through that time, now in great retrospect, looking back, I see how God has used that time to make a difference in the lives of so many people. But in the moment, I was too finite to see that. It wasn't until I got a whole lot of years later that I could look back and say, so maybe that's what was going on. And so therefore, how do we live in those kinds of times? Well, there's a guy named Thomas Merton. He has this wonderful prayer. It starts out by saying, Lord, I have no idea where I am going. I cannot see the road ahead of me. We just can't. I cannot know for certain where it will end. We just can't. And then he goes on and says, look, and not only do I not know where my road's going, I don't even really know myself. I'm a mystery to myself. And the fact that I think I'm following you, God, doesn't mean that I really am. But here's what I know. I know I have this desire to please you. And I know the desire to please you does in fact please you. And here's what else I know. I'm going to trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death, I'm going to trust you always. And I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. It's a pretty good posture of the heart. When you're in the midst of these dire, difficult situations, and right now you're so finite you just can't make sense out of it, trust is the only thing that's going to get you through. Now, as we are in this fallen world and with our very finite perspective, we need to realize that we have this thing called free will. And there are some times when we wind up misusing our free will. It does not wind up working to our advantage. When I talk about free will, I've used this in language in the past, and I think it's resonated with a whole lot of you guys. I say, hey, listen, you're free, you are powerful, you are capable, you are responsible, and you are accountable. But the last four come out of number one, you're free. And therefore, God has given you resources, abilities, but responsibility, accountability to use your freedom well with the resources that you have been entrusted. But it all happens because you're free. Listen, none of us want to be a robot, do we? None of us are interested in being a robot. Do you remember this movie, I, Robot? And here's what goes on about robots. Robots are not free, they're programmed. They have to follow their programming. But in this particular movie, there's a robot called Sonny that he's like an anomaly. There's something unusual going on. Sonny seems to have the ability to go against his programming. Sonny seems to have the ability to make choices that no other robot can make. And so that's the whole mystery of this movie. Is Sonny free or is he programmed? But listen, God didn't create human beings to be robots. You're not a robot. There's not a programming that you have to follow. If there was, you weren't free. By the way, a little more up to date, some of you might be familiar with the new series called The Umbrella Academy on Netflix. And what the Umbrella Academy is, it's a story of these sort of like odd, superheroes. They were all babies born on the same day. And this one dad decided he wanted to adopt all his kids so he could raise them and train them to become a force for good in the world. But the dad was just weird and, he was harsh and mean. But the kids lost their mother. And so the dad made a robot mother. And you look at the robot mother and she's young and she's sweet and she's pretty and she smiles and she says all the nice things, but she's programmed to say that. And she can't have any real live interaction with the kids, and the kids wind up growing up so frustrated, and eventually as one is older, he winds up deactivating her because she can only be a robot mom. She's not this free mom who can respond in the way that the kids need. I mean, we're not robots. Who wants to be a robot? We're not. And nor do we want to have somebody pulling our strings like we're just puppets, do this and do that, and hey, who wants to volunteer? And next thing our hand goes, well, why is my hand up there? And nobody wants to be a puppet. And you're not a puppet, you're not a robot, you're free. But wow, does that ever lead to some complications? Do you guys remember the movie Bruce Almighty? Remember that movie? Fun movie. A lot of actually pretty significant spiritual truth in it. So here's what happens. In the beginning of the movie, Bruce is working for a news station. Life is not going well. He's complaining and he's moaning and he's whining. And God, you're just not fair. Life's not fair. And the next thing you know is God shows up and he winds up saying to Bruce, well, listen, if I'm not doing such a good job, let me give you my God power. And he becomes Bruce Almighty and says, okay, you go ahead and fix things. And so what happens is Bruce begins to make everything about him. And Bruce is very self-indulgent and self-focused. And oh, by the way, he's ignoring his girlfriend, Grace, just keeps on doing things that hurt her. And then God shows up and says, hey, Bruce, listen, it's time that you start using, my God power for you to help humanity, not just help yourself. And Bruce agrees. He's not been doing a very good job on that. And so we're going to pick up a conversation where God's going to tell him what's involved with Bruce Almighty helping humanity. And we're going to see a little bit about this thing called free will. And we've got 3 different clips. They're all going to be strung together. So let's watch this. While we can show any video clips we want in our main auditorium, we're not allowed to broadcast them out. So what I've done is prepared a short little explanation of what we're seeing in the main auditorium. So in the movie clip we're watching in the main auditorium, God is telling Bruce about how he can begin to use his God powers to make a difference in the world. But then God says to Bruce, there's only 2 rules you have to remember. Number 1 is you can't tell anybody that you're God, and he explains why. But even more important is rule number 2, you don't mess with free will. And when Bruce hears that, he thinks for a moment and says, can I ask why? To which God laughs and says, well, yes, you can. That's exactly it. That's free will. You have the ability to ask and question and do all kinds of things. Well, now we move to the next scene. And this is where Bruce has lost the love of his life, Grace, because he's been so self-absorbed. He's done so many wrong things, and she's left him. And he's trying to get her back. And so he's violating rule number 2. He's trying to use his God power to love me, love me. And she is not responding. So he really starts to ramp up with pleading, love me, love me. And it ends with this final scene where she just looks at him and says, I did. And she turns and walks away. Now, the third scene we're going to be seeing in this is, it's one of the most poignant scenes in the whole movie, where it's pouring down rain and Bruce is so distraught in pain. And he's saying, well, she'll take me back, won't she? Won't she? And God asks Bruce, would you take you back? And he thinks a little more and he says, how do you make somebody love you without affecting their free will? To which God says, welcome to my world. How do you change people without affecting their free will? Pretty profound, isn't it? Welcome to God's world. How do you make people love you when you've given them free will? And rule number 2, you don't mess with free will. How do you make people love you? Welcome to God's world. How do you make people be good when you're giving them free will and they can choose to be bad? Welcome to God's world. How do you make people do what is right and love God and love others and serve the world? But when they don't want to, well, welcome to God's world. I mean, see, and now, by the way, we're in some really deep theological waters here, and I'm not going to swim in those very long, but listen, let me just welcome to God's world. You and I, we have been given this thing called free will, and we don't always use it very well. So here's one of the things that God does from very, very early on, and we can be reading this in Deuteronomy. Listen, you've been given free will, and I'm going to set before you life and death, so now choose life so that you and your children may live. Listen, you have free will, so use it rightly. Choose life. That you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice. Hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life. He'll give you many years in the land that he's given to your ancestors. So listen, just choose life, but you've got to choose life. Don't choose the other alternative. Choose life. And the reason for that is because there are always consequences with every choice that we make. When we come to Galatians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul is talking about the God who's given us free will, but also, listen, that God cannot be mocked. You can't trick him. You can't deceive him. You can't pull the wool over his eyes. You can't sneak around his back. Be aware that your choices have consequences. You reap what you sow. If you sow to please your flesh, in other words, if you sow to make bad decisions from bad motives and for bad reasons, you're going to reap really bad stuff. It's called destruction. But if you sow to please the Spirit, that is, if you do things that are in accordance with what God wants you to do, well, then you're going to wind up reaping some really good things. But listen, you can't do it just once. You can't get tired in doing what is good. You can't get tired in making good choices. You got to do it today and tomorrow and the day after that. And if you don't give up, in the long run, you're going to see the results of sowing really good stuff. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard to choose life. It's hard not to choose bad stuff. It's hard to choose to be good and moral and holy and pure and loving and forgiving. It's hard. You guys remember the old cartoon character Pogo? Remember that guy? We have met the enemy, and he is who? Us. Doesn't it seem like we are our own worst enemies as we are misusing our free will? We're misusing our free will and we're choosing to do stuff that's going to hurt us, and we wind up becoming our own worst enemy whenever we wind up doing that. We not only hurt ourselves, we hurt others. By the way, that's a dynamic going on in a fallen world. One of the reasons why there is so much difficulty in a fallen world is you are choosing to do some bad things, and when you choose to do bad things, it hurts you, but it also hurts people around you, doesn't it? And when others choose to do bad things, it not only hurts them, but it hurts you. And in fact, I know there's a whole lot of people here right now that some of your difficulty is not because you've done some bad things, but it's because other people who are very close to you, they've done some bad things, and you hurt a whole bunch because of their bad choices. But it turns around to be good. I mean, when you make good choices, not only do you thrive, but the people you love thrive. And when they make good choices, not only do they thrive, but you thrive as well. And by the way, can I just say, for all of you who have some positions of leadership and some influence, the more influence you have, the more imperative it is that you make as many good choices as possible, because you will affect so many people. Folks, I am so profoundly aware, our entire staff is so profoundly aware, we have got to make really good choices. We have got to stay away from doing dumb, stupid, foolish things. Because not only will we get hurt if we do, but we're going to hurt a whole lot of really precious people that we love. Does that make sense? So when we live in a fallen world and we choose with our free will to do some bad things, we just bring some more hurt away. So Jerry Sitzer, there was a person who used his free will to get stinking, roaring drunk and drive like a maniac and therefore crash and kill 3 people. Jerry's life moved into horrible groaning because of the free choice of another person. It's really interesting how we can be so self-destructive on these kinds of things. I read a study in Johns Hopkins University a number of years ago, and they were evaluating all their heart patients, and what they wound up doing is they say, so 1 year out, what's the lifestyle of heart patients 1 year out after we've been treating them, surgery a lot of times? And what they found is for about 90% of their patients, 1 year out, they had reverted to their pre-lifestyle habits of eating and exercise that led them to needing the heart surgery in the first place. Now, listen, I know that there are all kinds of things that happen just because our bodies are weak, but for 635,000 people, at least in part, they were making some bad choices that made their medical condition worse, and some of the reason they're suffering that particular thing is the choices they make. And then all of us who are in relationship with folks who are making bad choices, then we wind up getting the pain as well as them. Does that make sense? So it's, we don't have to blame God. It's just a fallen world and a lot of our bad choices. By the way, some of you are also living with some difficulty because the system and other people that are far removed from you are making some bad choices, and it just affects all of us. So that leads to point number 4 and point number 5, which I'm going to be really brief. I'm going to combine them together. There's a lot more in the devotional about these things. Point number 4 is God is able to work in these times of difficulty to form and shape our lives. In fact, some of the best forming and shaping goes on when we are in times of difficulty. Paul in Romans again talks about suffering. He says, he uses this really in almost over-the-top language. I rejoice in my sufferings because my suffering becomes the occasion for me to make good choices, and I'm patient, I persevere, I trust, I surrender. As I'm doing those things, a certain quality of character is growing in my life, and as character is growing, my hope gets stronger, and my experience of God's love gets stronger. And so it's really imperative for Paul is when you're in the midst of these difficult times, above all, that's when we need to choose life instead of choosing the other thing, not only make it worse. I used language before of level 5 leaders from Jim Collins, where Collins has studied these most extraordinary leaders on our planet, and he winds up saying that every one of them, they made the jump from these lower levels of leadership to this level 5 leadership because they have been through a time of crisis, suffering, difficulty. Some of them call it their wilderness experience, and in that time of great suffering, they wound up having a massive change. They let go of old values, old goals, old motives, old purposes, an old way of living that kept them at lower levels of leadership and sometimes harmful levels, and they wound up having sort of metanoia, repentance, complete transformation. They have become new people through the time of suffering. But by the way, they responded to it. They chose to do what was right in the time of suffering, and it took them to whole new levels. So they're level 5 leaders. Their companies changed because of it. And I love to think about you and I as maybe we can become these level 5 followers of Jesus. We're living at these lower levels of life, but as we go through suffering, if we respond, if we say yes to God, if we trust that He knows the way forward, even right now in our finite capacity we don't, if we trust Him, I wonder if through the times of difficulty that we have, we might slowly emerge into these like level 5 followers of Jesus. That's something beautiful and deep and wonderful and extensive is happening in our lives. And then along with that comes the promise that God is faithful. He's not finished with any of us. He's so faithful. He's not finished with any of us. Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God is working for the good. And all these bad things that the world is throwing and all of these bad things that our wrong choices are bringing, God is still in the midst of those bad things. Let me see how I can bring good out of this. But He says, respond, choose life. Choose life as I'm working to bring good, and let's see how far we can go. Let's get back to Jerry's story. The accident itself bewilders me as much today as it did 3 years ago. Much good has come from it, but all the good in the world will never make the accident itself good. And listen, that's really, really important. When bad things happen, even though God brings the good things out of the bad, God never says, hey, that bad thing is good, but I can do something good about the bad thing. Does that make sense? It remains a horrible, tragic, and evil event to me. Now, I don't believe I lost 3 members of my family in order that I might change for the better, raise 3 healthy children, or write a book. That's not the reason why that terrible accident happened. The terrible accident happened because he lives in a fallen world and somebody used their free will to make a horrible decision. I still want them back. I always will. But listen to the formation that has taken place. And you see, he tells the story here of the formation, but listen now to the grief I feel is as sweet as well as bitter. I still have a sorrowful soul, and yet I wake up every morning joyful and eager for the new day. Never have I felt as much pain as I have in the last 3 years, and yet never have I experienced as much pleasure at simply being alive. Never have I felt so broken, yet never have I felt so whole. Never have I been so aware of my weakness and vulnerability, and yet never have I felt so content and strong. Never has my soul been more dead, and yet never has my soul been more alive. Do you hear like the paradox, the mystery of what's going on in this formation process? My soul's been stretched. Above all, I've become aware of the power of God's grace and my need for it. My soul has grown because it's been awakened to the goodness and love of God through this catastrophic loss. Because I've slowly learned how to respond to God when I could not see the way forward, my soul has been stretched and expanded and filled with the goodness of God, who's always faithful and is always working. God will continue to be present to the end of my life. He's growing my soul, making it bigger, filling it with Himself. Now He speaks to all of us just a little bit. The supreme challenge to any one of us, whether we're facing just some pretty difficult times, but catastrophic loss, it involves facing the darkness of the loss on one hand, and learning to live with renewed vitality on the other. Loss can diminish us, but it can also expand us. It depends, once again, on the choices we make who have free will. That was my words, not his. And the grace we receive. He finishes with this. He said, on his wedding day, he and Laura, one of the songs they sang was one of their favorites. It was called Be Thou My Vision. They sang that on their wedding day. And they sang it through the days of their marriage and family. And he said, I had to sing that song on her funeral day. Because that's what I needed more than anything through all of my life is for God to be the vision that sustains me and guides me into the future. We sang it on our funeral, and I've been singing it ever since. And he said, I'm going to keep on singing it till the day that I die. And we'll probably sing it at my funeral. See, that's what we need. We need a vision of the love and goodness and greatness of the God who is with us. You're not on your own. You're not alone. No matter how hard life gets.